Hi everyone. Today we'll be looking at the United States during the decade of the 1950s, a time some scholars refer to as the golden age of capitalism, a period of economic expansion, stable prices, low unemployment, and rising standards of living that would continue all the way into the early 1970s. Between 1946 and 1960, the American gross national product more than doubled. Much of the benefit flowed to ordinary citizens through rising wages. In every measurable way, diet, housing, income, education, and recreation, most Americans lived better than their parents and grandparents had. Numerous innovations came into widespread use during these years that completely transformed Americans' lives. They included television, home air conditioning, automatic dishwashers, inexpensive long-distance telephone calls, and jet air travel. Here in our first image, we see a neighborhood gathering inside a family living room, everyone piled in together to watch one of the early TV sets, complete with rabbit ear antenna. Like other wars, the Cold War fueled U.S. industrial production and promoted a redistribution of the nation's population and economic resources. The West, especially the Seattle area, Southern California, and the Rocky Mountain states, benefited enormously from government contracts for things like aircraft, guided missiles, and radar systems. The South became the home of numerous military bases and government-funded shipyards. In retrospect, the 1950s appear as the last decade of the industrial age in the United States. Since then, the American economy has shifted rapidly towards services, education, information, finance, and entertainment, while employment in manufacturing has declined. Unions' very success in raising wages inspired employers to mechanize more and more elements of manufacturing in order to reduce labor costs. In 1956, for the first time in American history, white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar factory and manual laborers. The main engines of economic growth during the 1950s were residential construction and spending on consumer goods. The post-war baby boom and the shift of population from cities to suburbs created an enormous demand for housing, television sets, home appliances, and especially cars. Over the course of the decade, the number of houses in the U.S. doubled, nearly all of them built, as we see in this image, in the suburbs that sprang up across the landscape. At the same time, suburbs required a new form of shopping center, the mall, to which, as we can see in this image, people drove in their cars. The automobile, the pivot on which suburban life turned, completely transformed the nation's daily life, just as the interstate highway system transformed Americans' travel habits, making possible long-distance vacationing by car, and commuting to work from ever-increasing distances. The result was an altered American landscape, leading to the construction, as we can see in these photos, to things like roadside motels, drive-in movie theaters, like the one we see here. I think this is an image from somewhere in Indiana in the 50s. And of course, fast food eating establishments. Here we have the very first McDonald's restaurant, opened in Illinois in 1954. The car symbolized the identification of freedom with individual mobility and private choice. California became the most prominent symbol of the post-war suburban boom. Between World War II and 1975, more than 30 million Americans moved west of the Mississippi River. In 1963, California surpassed New York to become the nation's most populous state. What were called centerless western cities, like Houston, Texas, Phoenix, Arizona, and Los Angeles, California, differed greatly from traditional urban centers in the East. Rather than consisting of downtown business districts linked to residential neighborhoods by public transportation, Western cities were decentralized clusters of single-family homes and businesses united by a web of highway, an idea of which we can get from this aerial view of Los Angeles, taken in 1952. Life centered around the car. People drove to and from work, and they did their shopping at malls, reachable only by driving. Thanks to television, images of middle-class life and advertisements for consumer goods blanketed the country. By the end of the 1950s, nearly 9 of 10 American families owned a TV set. Television replaced newspapers as the most common source of information about public events, and TV watching became the nation's leading leisure activity. With a few exceptions, like the Army McCarthy hearings, TV avoided controversy and projected a bland image of middle-class life. The dominant programs were quiz shows, like the one captured in this image, westerns, like Gunsmoke, and comedies set in suburban homes, like Leave It to Beaver, and the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Television also became the most effective advertising medium ever invented. The emergence of suburbia placed pressure on the family, and especially on women, to live up to freedom's promise. After a sharp post-war drop in female employment, the number of women at work soon began to rise again. By 1955, it exceeded the level attained during World War II. But the nature and aims of women's work had changed. The modern woman worked part-time to help support the family's middle-class lifestyle, not to help pull it out of poverty or to pursue personal fulfillment or an independent career. Working women in 1960 earned, on average, only 60% of the income of men. Despite the increasing numbers of wage-earning women, the suburban family's breadwinner was assumed to be male, while the wife remained at home. Films, TV shows, and advertisements portrayed marriage as the most important goal of American women. Here we have a couple of 1950s ads that make the point. During the 1950s, men and women married younger, at an average age of 22 for men and 20 for women. They also divorced less frequently than in the past, and had more children, an average of 3.2 per family. A baby boom that lasted into the mid-1960s, of which we get an idea from this image, followed the end of the war. At a time of low immigration, the American population rose by nearly 30 million, almost 20%. Like other forms of dissent, feminism seemed to have disappeared from American life, or was widely dismissed as evidence of mental disorder. Prominent psychologists in the 1950s insisted that the unhappiness of individual women, or even the desire to work for wages, stemmed from a failure to accept the so-called maternal instinct. For millions of city dwellers, the suburban utopia fulfilled the dream, postponed by the Depression and World War II, of home ownership and middle-class incomes. The move to the suburbs also promoted Americanization, cutting residents off from urban ethnic communities and bringing them fully into the world of mass consumption. But if the suburbs offered a new site for the enjoyment of American freedom, they retained at least one familiar characteristic: rigid racial boundaries. As late as the 1990s, nearly 90% of suburban whites lived in communities with non-white populations of less than 1%. This was the legacy of decisions by government, real estate developers, banks, and residents. During the post-war suburban boom, federal agencies continued to insure mortgages that barred resale of houses to non-whites, thereby effectively financing housing segregation. Even after the Supreme Court in 1948 declared such provisions legally unenforceable, banks and private developers barred non-whites from the suburbs. The government refused to subsidize their mortgages, except in segregated enclaves. At the same time, under programs of what was called urban renewal, cities demolished poor neighborhoods and city centers that occupied potentially valuable real estate, an example of which we see in this photograph. In their place, developers constructed retail centers and all-white middle-income housing complexes, and states built urban public universities. White residents displaced by urban renewal often moved to the suburbs, Non-whites, unable to do so, found housing in run-down city neighborhoods, inner cities, as they came to be known, such as the one captured in this image, taken from Chicago in the 1950s. Suburbanization hardened the racial lines of division in American life. Between 1950 and 1970, about 7 million white Americans left cities for the suburbs. Meanwhile, nearly 3 million blacks moved from the South to the North, greatly increasing the size of existing urban ghettos and creating entirely new ones. The process of racial exclusion became self-reinforcing. Non-whites remained concentrated in manual and unskilled jobs, the result of employment discrimination and their virtual exclusion from educational opportunities at public and private universities, including those outside the South. As the white population and industrial jobs fled the old city centers for the suburbs, poorer blacks and Latinos remained trapped in inner cities, seen now by many whites as places of crime, poverty, and welfare. Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Ike, as he was affectionately called, emerged from World War II as the military leader with the greatest political appeal. For his running mate on the Republican presidential ticket in 1952, Eisenhower chose Richard Nixon of California, a World War II veteran who had made a name for himself with his vigorous anti-communism. Here we see the two together. Television was beginning to transform politics by allowing candidates to bring carefully crafted images directly into Americans' living rooms. The 1952 campaign became the first to make extensive use of TV ads. More important to the election's outcome, however, was Eisenhower's popularity and the public's weariness with the Korean War. Ike's pledge to go to Korea in search of peace signaled his intention to bring the conflict to an end. He won a resounding victory over the Democratic candidate, seen here, Adlai Stevenson, then the governor of Illinois. 4 years later, Eisenhower defeated Stevenson again to win re-election by an even wider margin than in 1952. With a Republican serving as president for the first time in 20 years, the tone in Washington changed. Wealthy businessmen dominated Eisenhower's cabinet. A champion of the business community and a fiscal conservative, Ike worked to scale back government spending, including the military budget. But although right-wing Republicans saw his victory as an invitation to roll back the New Deal, Eisenhower realized such a course would be disastrous. He called his domestic agenda modern republicanism. It aimed to sever his party's identification in the minds of many Americans with the Great Depression. The core New Deal programs not only remained in place under Eisenhower, they expanded. Ike presided over the largest public works enterprise in American history, adding 41,000 miles to the interstate highway system. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial Earth satellite, in 1957, the Eisenhower administration responded with the National Defense Education Act, which for the first time offered direct federal funding to higher education. All in all, rather than dismantling the New Deal, Eisenhower's modern republicanism consolidated and legitimized it. Soon after he entered office, Eisenhower approved an armistice that ended the fighting in Korea. But this failed to ease international tensions. Ike took office at a time when the Cold War had entered an extremely dangerous phase. In 1952, the United States exploded the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than those that had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here we see the immense mushroom cloud from the test. The following year, the Soviets matched the achievement, gaining for the first time an apparent nuclear parity with the U.S. Here we see the mushroom cloud from the Soviet test of the hydrogen bomb in 1953. Both sides feverishly developed long-range bombers capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction around the world. A professional soldier, Eisenhower hated war, which he viewed as a tragic waste. But his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, seen here in a photo with the president, was a grim Cold Warrior. In 1954, Dulles announced what came to be effectively an updated version of the doctrine of containment. Massive retaliation, as it was called, declared that any Soviet attack on an American ally would be countered by a nuclear assault on the Soviet Union itself. Massive retaliation, of course, ran the risk that any small conflict or even a miscalculation could escalate into a war that would destroy both so-called superpowers. The reality that an all-out war would result in what became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD in military shorthand, did succeed in making both the U.S. and Soviet Union more cautious in their direct dealings with each other. But it also inspired widespread fear of impending nuclear war. Government programs encouraging Americans to build bomb shelters in their backyards and school drills that trained children to hide under their desks, to duck and cover, as the saying went, aimed to convince Americans that nuclear war was survivable, which of course was not true. This image shows us what the residential bomb shelters of the time looked like. And here we have a photo of the duck and cover drills students had to go through. Not unlike the active shooter drills we ask children and young people to endure today in our schools. The end of the Korean War and the death of Joseph Stalin, both of which occurred in 1953, convinced Eisenhower that rather than being blind zealots, the Soviets were reasonable and could be dealt with in conventional diplomatic terms. In 1955, as we see in this photograph, Ike met with the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, in Geneva, Switzerland. The following year, Khrushchev delivered a speech to the Communist Party Congress in Moscow that detailed Stalin's crimes, including purges of political opponents, numbering in the millions. Khrushchev's call in the same 1956 address for peaceful coexistence with the United States raised the possibility of an easing of tensions in the Cold War. The thaw, however, was abruptly shaken that fall when Soviet troops put down an anti-communist uprising in Hungary. Eisenhower refused to extend aid to the Hungarian rebels, an indication that he believed it impossible to roll back Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. In 1958, the two superpowers agreed to a voluntary halt to the testing of nuclear weapons that would last until 1961. The spirit of cooperation abruptly ended in 1960 after the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane over their territory. Here in this photo we see Khrushchev observing some of the wreckage. Eisenhower at first denied that the plane had been involved in espionage, and he refused to apologize even after the Russians produced the captured pilot, Gary Powers, who we see here in the mugshot the Soviets released at the time. The incident ended any hope of another summit meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. Even as Europe, where the Cold War began, settled into what appeared to be a permanent division between a communist East and a capitalist West, an intense rivalry, which sometimes took a military form, persisted in what came to be called the Third World. The term was invented to describe developing countries aligned with neither of the two sides in the Cold War. Countries who wanted to find their own model of development between Soviet centralized economic planning and free market capitalism. But none of these nations could avoid being strongly affected by the political, military, and economic contest of the Cold War. The post-World War II era witnessed the crumbling of European empires. Decolonization began when India and Pakistan, which was carved out of India to give Muslims their own nation, achieved independence in 1947. 10 years later, Britain's Gold Coast colony in West Africa emerged as the independent nation of Ghana. Other new nations, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Tanzania soon followed. The Soviet Union strongly supported the dissolution of Europe's overseas empires, and communists often participated in movements for colonial independence in these years. By the end of the 1950s, much of the focus of the Cold War had shifted to the Third World. From the perspective of the Eisenhower administration, the policy of containment could easily shift over into opposition to any government, whether communist or not, that seemed opposed to American economic or strategic interests. Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in Guatemala, who we have in this image, and Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, captured in this photograph. There's Guzman again, so we get a better look at him. And Mossadegh of Iran. Both men were popularly elected, homegrown nationalists, not agents of Moscow. But they were determined to reduce foreign corporations' control over their country's economies. Arbenz embarked on a sweeping land reform policy that threatened the domination of Guatemala's economy by the American-owned United Fruit Company. Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, whose refinery in Iran was Britain's largest remaining overseas asset. In 1953 and 1954, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, organized the ouster of both the Arbenz and the Mossadegh governments, a clear violation of the UN Charter, which barred member states from taking military action against another, except in self-defense. In 1956, Israel, France, and Britain, without prior consultation with the U.S., invaded Egypt after the country's nationalist leader, seen here, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, at the time jointly owned by Britain and France. A furious Eisenhower forced them to abandon the invasion. It was in the wake of the Suez fiasco in 1956 that the United States moved to replace Britain as the dominant Western power in the Middle East. In Vietnam, the expulsion of the Japanese in 1945 led not to independence, but to a French military effort to preserve France's Asian empire against Ho Chi Minh's nationalist forces. Here again we see an image of Ho Chi Minh. Anti-communism led the United States into deeper and deeper involvement in Vietnam. Following a policy initiated by Truman, the Eisenhower administration funneled billions of dollars in aid to bolster French efforts. By the early 1950s, the U.S. was paying 4/5 of the cost of the war. Wary of becoming bogged down in another land war in Asia immediately after Korea, Ike declined to send in American troops when France requested them to avert defeat in 1954, which effectively left France no alternative but to agree to Vietnamese independence. A peace conference in Geneva divided Vietnam temporarily into northern and southern districts, with elections scheduled for 1956 to unify the country. But the staunchly anti-communist southern leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, urged on by the U.S., refused to hold elections, which would almost certainly have resulted in a victory for Ho Chi Minh's communists. American aid poured into South Vietnam to bolster the Diem regime. By the time Eisenhower left office, Diem nevertheless still faced a full-scale guerrilla revolt by the communist-led National Liberation Front. Little by little, the United States was becoming accustomed to intervention, both open and secret, in far-flung corners of the world. Despite the Cold War rhetoric of freedom, American leaders seemed more comfortable dealing with reliable military regimes than democratic governments. A series of military governments succeeded Arbenz in Guatemala. The Shah of Iran, captured in this photo, replaced Mossadegh and remained in office until 1979 as one of the world's most tyrannical rulers, until his overthrow in the Iranian Revolution, led by the fiercely anti-American radical Islamist cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, seen here in this image. In Vietnam, the American decision to prop up the Diem regime laid the groundwork for what became, at least up to that time, the most disastrous military involvement in U.S. history. Consensus was the dominant ideal in an era in which McCarthyism had defined criticism of the social and economic order as disloyalty, and most Americans located the enjoyment of freedom in private pleasures rather than the public sphere. But dissenting voices could be heard. The sociologist C. Wright Mills, seen here, challenged the self-satisfied vision of democratic pluralism that dominated mainstream social science in the 1950s. Mills wrote of a power elite, an interlocking directorate of corporate leaders, politicians, and military men whose domination of government and society had made political democracy effectively obsolete. Other writers worried that modern mass society inevitably produced loneliness and anxiety, causing mankind to yearn for stability and authority, not freedom. In The Lonely Crowd, published in 1950, David Reisman, captured in this photo, described Americans as what he called other-directed conformists who lacked the inner resources to lead truly independent lives. Other social critics charged that corporate bureaucracies had transformed employees into what were called organization men, incapable of independent thought. William White's The Organization Man and Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders, published in 1956 and 1957, criticized the monotony of modern work, the emptiness of suburban life, and the pervasive influence of advertising. Here we have a picture of White. And Packard. All of these works created the vocabulary effectively for an assault on the nation's social values that lay just over the horizon. The social critics did not offer a political alternative or have any real impact on the parties or government, nor did other stirrings of dissent in these years. With teenagers a growing part of the population thanks to the baby boom, the rise of a popular culture geared to the emerging youth market suggested that significant generational tensions lay beneath the bland surface of 1950s life. The 1955 films Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause, from which we have the poster broadsides here, highlighted the alienation of at least some young people from the world of adult respectability. These works helped to spur a mid-1950s panic about so-called juvenile delinquency. Cultural life during the decade seemed far more daring to young people than politics did. Teenagers wore leather jackets and danced to rock and roll music that brought the hard-driving rhythms and sexually provocative movements of black musicians and dancers to enthusiastic, young white audiences. They made Elvis Presley, seen here, a rock and roll singer with an openly sexual performance style, an immensely popular entertainment celebrity of the era. In New York City and in San Francisco, as well as college towns, places like Madison, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, the Beats, or Beatniks, a small group of poets and writers, railed against mainstream culture. Here in this photograph we see some beatniks of the period. Rejecting the work ethic, the desperate materialism of the suburban middle class, and the militarization of American life by the Cold War, the beatniks celebrated impulsive action, immediate pleasure, often enhanced by drugs, and sexual experimentation. Despite Cold War slogans, they insisted personal and political repression, not freedom, were the hallmarks of American society. Few people predicted the emergence of the Southern mass movement for civil rights in the 1950s. The United States in these years was still a segregated, unequal society. Half of the nation's black families lived in poverty. In the South, evidence of Jim Crow abounded in separate public institutions and the signs, white and colored, at entrances to buildings, train carriages, drinking fountains, and restrooms. Here we see a typical Jim Crow sign fronting a business from the period. In the North and West, the law did not require segregation, but custom barred blacks from many colleges, hotels, and restaurants, and from most suburban housing. Las Vegas, Nevada, for example, was as strictly segregated as any southern city. Hotels and casinos did not admit blacks, except in the most menial jobs. In 1950, 17 southern and border states in Washington, D.C. had laws requiring the racial segregation of public schools, and several others permitted local districts to impose it. In northern communities, housing patterns and school district lines created de facto segregation, that is, separation in fact, if not in law. Few white Americans felt any urgency about confronting racial inequality. With the Eisenhower administration reluctant to address the issue, it fell to the courts to confront the problem of racial segregation. For years, the NAACP, under the leadership of attorneys Charles Hamilton Houston, seen here, and Thurgood Marshall, who we have in this photo, pressed legal challenges to the separate but equal doctrine laid down by the court in 1896's Plessy v. Ferguson case. At first, the NAACP sought to gain admission to white institutions of higher learning for which no black equivalent existed. In 1938, the Supreme Court ordered the University of Missouri Law School to admit Lloyd Gaines, a black student, because the state had no such school for blacks. Missouri responded by setting up a segregated law school, satisfying the courts. But in 1950, the Supreme Court unanimously ordered Haman Sweat admitted to the University of Texas Law School, even though the state had established a so-called school for him in a basement containing 3 classrooms and no library. Thurgood Marshall decided to launch a frontal assault on segregation itself. He brought the NAACP's support to local cases that had arisen when black parents challenged unfair school policies. Black children attended class in buildings with no running water or indoor toilets, and were not provided with buses to transport them to classes. 5 such cases from 4 states and the District of Columbia were combined in a single appeal that reached the Supreme Court in 1952. When cases are united, they're listed alphabetically, and the first case gives the entire decision its name. Oliver Brown went to court because his daughter, a 3rd grader, was forced to walk across dangerous railroad tracks each morning rather than being allowed to attend a nearby school restricted to whites. His lawsuit became Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Marshall decided that the time had come to attack the separate but equal doctrine directly. Even with the same funding and facilities, he argued, segregation was inherently unequal because it stigmatized one group of citizens as unfit to associate with others. In its legal brief, the Eisenhower administration did not directly support Marshall's position, but it urged the justices to consider the problem of racial discrimination in the context of the present world struggle between freedom and tyranny. Other peoples, it noted, cannot understand how such a practice can exist in a country which professes to be a staunch supporter of freedom, justice, and democracy. The new Chief Justice, Earl Warren, seen here, managed to create unanimity on a divided court, some of whose members disliked segregation, but feared that a decision to outlaw it would spark widespread violence. On May 17, 1954, Warren himself read aloud the decision, only 11 pages long. Segregation in public education, he concluded, violated the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. In the field of education, said the court, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Here we see the headlines from the decision, carried in the New York Times of the day. The decision did not order immediate implementation, but instead called for hearings as to how segregated schooling should be dismantled. Disappointing as this was, the Brown decision marked the emergence of the Warren Court as an active agent of social change, and it inspired a wave of optimism that discrimination might soon disappear. The Brown decision did not cause the modern civil rights movement, but it did ensure that when the movement resumed after waning in the early 1950s, it would have the backing of the federal courts. Mass action against Jim Crow soon reappeared. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a black tailor's assistant who had just completed her day's work in a Montgomery, Alabama department store, refused, as we see in this famous photograph, to surrender her seat on a city bus to a white rider, as required by local law. Parks' arrest sparked a year-long bus boycott and marked the beginning of the mass phase of the civil rights movement in the South. When news of what happened to Parks began to spread, hundreds of blacks gathered in a local church and vowed to refuse to ride the buses until accorded equal treatment. For 381 days, despite legal harassment and occasional violence, black maids, janitors, teachers, and students walked to their destinations or rode an informal network of taxis. Here we have a photo from the early days of the protest taken by Life magazine photographers. Finally, in November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public transportation unconstitutional. The boycott ended in triumph, and it marked a turning point in post-war American history. It launched the movement for racial justice as a nonviolent crusade based in the black churches of the South. It gained the support of Northern liberals and focused unprecedented and unwelcome international attention on the country's racial policies. And it marked the emergence, as we see in this image, of the 26-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who'd only recently arrived in Montgomery to become pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church as the movement's national symbol. King presented the case for black rights in a vocabulary that merged the black experience with that of the nation. Having studied the writings of Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi on peaceful civil disobedience, King outlined a philosophy of struggle in which evil must be met with good, hate with Christian love, and violence with peaceful demands for change. Echoing Christian themes derived from his training in the black church, King's speeches resonated deeply in both black communities and the broader American culture of the time. Buoyed by success in Montgomery, King in 1956 took the lead in forming what became known as the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or SCLC, a coalition of black ministers and civil rights activists to press for desegregation. But despite the movement's success and popular mobilization, the fact that Montgomery officials agreed to the boycott's demands only after a Supreme Court ruling indicated that without national backing, local action might not be enough to overturn Jim Crow. The white South's refusal to accept the Brown decision reinforced the conviction that black citizens could not gain their constitutional rights without Washington's intervention, and that was not immediately forthcoming. When the Supreme Court finally issued its implementation ruling in 1955, the justices declared that desegregation should proceed, in the words of the court, with all deliberate speed. This vague formulation unintentionally encouraged a campaign of what became known as massive resistance that paralyzed civil rights progress in much of the South. In 1956, 82 of 106 Southern congressmen signed a so-called Southern Manifesto denouncing the Brown decision as a clear abuse of judicial power and calling for resistance to what they characterized as forced integration. State after state began to pass laws to block desegregation. Virginia pioneered the strategy of closing any public schools ordered to desegregate. It then offered funds to enable white students, but not black ones, to attend private institutions. The federal government attempted to remain aloof from the black struggle. President Eisenhower failed to provide any kind of leadership on the issue. He called for Americans to abide by the law, but he made it clear that he found the whole civil rights matter distasteful. In 1957, however, after Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas used the state's National Guard to prevent the court-ordered integration of Little Rock Central High School, Eisenhower dispatched federal troops to the city. In the face of a howling mob of angry whites, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division escorted 9 black children into the school. They became known as the Little Rock Nine. Here we have some images from the events in Little Rock. The first capturing the white protests against integrating the school. And the next one here showing Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine, working her way through the mob. She was 15 years old. The last 2 images show the troops escorting the black students into the school. The events in Little Rock showed that at least when push came to shove, the federal government would not allow the flagrant violation of court orders. But because of massive resistance in the South, the pace of the civil rights movement slowed down again in the final years of the 1950s. The presidential campaign of 1960 turned out to be one of the closest in American history. Republicans chose Vice President Richard Nixon as their candidate to succeed Eisenhower. Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy, captured in this photo, a senator from Massachusetts, and a Roman Catholic whose father, a millionaire Irish-American businessman, had served as ambassador to Great Britain under FDR in the 1930s. The atmosphere of tolerance promoted by World War II had weakened traditional anti-Catholicism. but many Protestants remained reluctant to vote for a Catholic, fearing that Kennedy would be required to support church doctrine on controversial public issues, or, in a more extreme version, take orders directly from the Pope in Rome. Kennedy addressed the question directly, saying, "I do not speak for the church on public matters, and the church doesn't speak for me." At age 43, Kennedy became the youngest major party nominee for president in the nation's history. Both Kennedy and Nixon were ardent Cold Warriors, but Kennedy pointed to Soviet success in putting Sputnik, the first Earth satellite, into orbit, and subsequently testing the first intercontinental ballistic missile, as evidence that the U.S. had lost the sense of national purpose necessary to fight the Cold War. He warned that Republicans had allowed a so-called missile gap to develop, in which the Soviets had achieved technological and military superiority over the United States. In fact, as both Kennedy and Nixon well knew, American economic and military capacity far exceeded that of the Soviets. But the charge persuaded many Americans that the time had come for new leadership. The stylishness of Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline, seen with JFK in this photograph, reinforced the impression that Kennedy would conduct a more youthful, vigorous presidency. In the first televised debate between presidential candidates in the country's history, at least judging by viewer response, the handsome Kennedy bested Nixon, who was suffering from a cold and appeared tired and nervous. Here we have an image from the first presidential TV debate. Those who heard the encounter on the radio thought Nixon had won, but on TV, image counted for more than substance. That November, Kennedy eked out a narrow victory, winning the popular vote by only 120,000 out of 69 million votes cast. The margin, though, allowed him to carry Illinois, and with it, the election. In January 1961, shortly before leaving office, Eisenhower delivered a televised farewell address, modeled to some extent on George Washington's farewell address of 1796. Here in our vinyl image, we see the president as he appeared on TV at the time. Knowing that the missile gap was a myth, Ike warned against the drumbeat of calls for a new military buildup. He urged Americans to think about the dangerous power of what he called the military-industrial complex, the conjunction of an immense military establishment with a permanent arms industry. As he warned, we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. Few Americans shared the president's concern. Far more saw the alliance of the Defense Department and private industry as a source of jobs and national security rather than a threat to democracy. A few years later, however, with the United States locked in an increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam, Eisenhower's warning would come to seem prophetic, as it still does. By then, other underpinnings of 1950s life were also in disarray. The tens of millions of cars that made suburban life possible were spewing toxic lead, an additive to make gasoline more efficient, into the atmosphere. Penned into the east by mountains that kept automobile emissions from being dispersed by the wind, Los Angeles, California had become synonymous with smog, a type of air pollution produced by cars. The chemical insecticides that enabled agricultural conglomerates to produce the country's remarkable abundance of food were poisoning farm workers, consumers, and the water supply. Housewives were rebelling against a life centered in suburban dream homes. And finally, Black Americans were increasingly impatient with the slow progress of racial change. The United States had entered one of the most turbulent and divisive decades in its history, the 1960s, which, of course, is where we'll pick things up next time.